David Stagg discovered the dead body of his partner, Bill Jennings.
Shawnee 911, your emergency?
There's blood all over.
He believed Jennings had committed suicide.
I think he choked himself.
Investigators were not convinced.
Obviously, there was some kind of struggle that took place in the house.
David Stagg became the primary murder suspect.
Bill Jennings fought for his life and lost at the hands of David Stagg.
But had an innocent man been wrongly accused?
I think the person that murdered Bill Jennings was someone that came over that night after David Stagg left.
Two teams of experts assessed the evidence to find out who had killed Bill Jennings.
Strangulation is a very intimate way to die.
Was Stagg guilty or innocent?
There was no physical evidence whatsoever.
But what would a jury decide? It was a typical Saturday night in Kansas. Partners Bill Jennings and David Stagg were spending a quiet evening at home.
Well, it was a commuter relationship. I live in Warrensburg, Missouri, which is about 45 miles away, and so we'd see each other on the weekends, usually at his home. We did share a lot of interests. We saw a lot of friends. I'm a passionate bridge player, and he learned to play bridge.
David and Bill had planned to spend the evening alone.
We decided to get a video to watch that evening, and we were going to have dinner at home.
But their evening didn't go as planned.
We had a discussion about our relationship, and then he said, well, I think you should leave tonight. I loaded my car up and left his place around 11 o'clock.
The following day, Shawnee Police Department received a frantic 911 call.
Somebody just committed suicide.
What happened?
David Stagg sounded desperate as he made the emergency call.
He committed suicide last night.
Okay.
I just got here, but I think he choked himself.
Shawnee Police Officer Matt Sumter responded to the call.
The alert tones went out over the radio, and dispatch sent me on a non-breather possible suicide.
Sumter was the first police officer to arrive at the scene.
I saw Mr. Stagg standing at the end of the driveway here. He looked like he'd been crying. And I said, well, what happened? And he said he strangled himself.
He followed David into the house, where he was confronted by a disturbing scene.
That's when I saw Mr. Jennings with his arms tucked in like this, lying face down, with his neck stuck in the wrought iron curl of a large bird cage.
51-year-old Bill Jennings was dead, but it didn't look like a typical suicide.
He had some trauma to his face that I could see, and some blood was dripping off of his nose.
As the officer surveyed the scene, it seemed evident there had been a struggle in the house.
There was a blood smear on the kitchen wall, some blood smear and some drops on the kitchen floor, some blood on the living room floor, and then there were some teeth on the kitchen floor as well. It took me less than a minute to where I determined that this was not a suicide.
But David Stagg insisted it was.
He was shaking his head saying, I knew he would do this. I knew he would strangle himself.
Investigators needed to establish the cause of death. Johnson County Deputy Coroner Michael Handler carried out the postmortem.
William Jennings had evidence of a violent struggle. Large numbers of bruises and abrasions, lacerations. He had broken teeth. In my opinion, it is not possible that these wounds were self-inflicted.
Dr. Handler discovered other telling wounds.
He's got abrasions and contusions on both knees, along both shins, on the tops of all toes, and the tops of both feet. And I believe that this injury pattern was sustained as he struggled to free himself as he was being strangled in the base of the birdcage.
There seemed to be only one conclusion.
In my opinion, William Jennings did not die of a suicide. This was clearly a homicide.
With police suspicions confirmed, Shawnee Police Lieutenant Dan Tennis launched the investigation. He began with the crime scene.
We had our crime scene unit there at the scene, and they were doing some of the physical evidence collection. Fingerprints, blood smears on the floor. We had blood smears on carpet, DNA.
They considered the possible scenarios.
We ruled out burglary and robbery. We looked through the house and didn't find anything that was taken.
But one item could provide clues.
They noticed a laptop computer in the kitchen area, and we recovered that computer. Obviously, we were very interested in knowing who Bill Jennings had been talking to, whether he had some friend that no one knew about.
When the computer was examined, evidence suggested a likely suspect.
We found that there was a suicide note typed on that computer, and that document in the first sentence said, "This has nothing to do with David." Our opinion was that it was highly likely that David Stagg was the one who typed that, quote, suicide note.
Had David Stagg killed Bill Jennings and then staged the scene to suggest a suicide?
We've already got David Stagg saying that he was with Bill Jennings up until 11 that Saturday night. So I asked David Stagg to allow us to interview him.
With the suspicious suicide note and the fact that he was the last person to see Bill alive, David Stagg was quickly becoming the prime suspect.
And you've been together for about 2.5 years?
Yeah, we were having trouble. He never felt like I loved him enough. I always felt like he was a little controlling of everything that I was doing.
Bill was not happy with being separated during the week.
Could the unhappy relationship have ended in murder? Investigators pressed for details about David and Bill's final evening together.
We started taking dinner between 8 and 9 and started watching the movie.
I was pretty exhausted, so I started falling asleep, and that upset him.
The couple had then argued.
Did he push you or did you push him?
I think he pushed me, and then I think I might have pushed him.
David insisted things didn't go further.
So when he asked you to leave, do you mean he asked you to
stay someplace else and leave, take the stuff, yeah.
Investigators thought David's story seemed highly suspicious. They were convinced he was withholding vital information.
I think he tried to asphyxiate himself. Now, I don't know whether, I know he'd fallen and cut his head.
What do you think may have happened to him?
I think he committed suicide.
And even when I told him that we had proof that it was a homicide, David Stagg said, "The more you tell me, the more I believe it's a suicide and that Bill did this to himself."
To investigators, David's insistence of suicide seemed to confirm his guilt.
Based on our investigation, we determined that this was a staged crime scene, that David Stagg tried to cover up his tracks.
On August 3rd, 2005, 57-year-old David Stagg was arrested and charged with the murder of his partner